It's like every so often you just get hit with this realization, right? You hear about these massive shifts happening all around us. One day, it's like, boom, some new tech just wipes out an entire industry. Or some little startup nobody's ever heard of just comes out of nowhere and completely disrupts some huge established market.
Yeah, absolutely.
It can even get kind of personal. You see people straight up copying your ideas, trying to undercut you at every turn.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Happens all the time.
And it makes you wonder, what's the real difference? What separates those who just get swept aside by all this change from those who not only manage to survive, but actually thrive in it?
Right, right. Like, how do they do it? What's the secret sauce?
That's exactly what we're going to dive into today. We're exploring this really intriguing book by Seth Godin called Poke the Box.
Poke the box, yeah. It's not your typical business book,
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's more like a direct challenge to the way we often think about work and creativity and success.
Totally. Godin gets right to the heart of it. He's talking about this crucial element that we so often underestimate, the power of taking initiative.
Exactly. Just the simple act of starting, of getting things moving.
Even when it feels messy, even when you're not totally sure where you're going, just start.
In this deep dive, we're going to pull out those key insights from Poke the Box, those aha moments that really illuminate why taking that first step, even when it feels scary, is so incredibly vital in the world we live in today.
And this isn't just for entrepreneurs either.
Right. This isn't just for people dreaming of launching the next big startup. This is for everyone.
Absolutely. This deep dive is for anyone who's ever felt stuck, anyone who wants to make a bigger impact, anyone who's ever had an idea but wasn't sure how to bring it to life.
Our goal today is to distill those core principles of initiative, those fundamental ideas that anyone in any field with any level of expertise can actually integrate into their lives and their work.
We want you to walk away from this conversation with a clearer sense of how to break through that initial hesitation.
How to overcome that fear of failure.
How to navigate all the inevitable bumps in the road.
And ultimately, how to make a real meaningful difference right where you are.
Think of this deep dive as your cheat sheet to understanding this mindset, a mindset that can truly change everything.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Godin starts with this really compelling story about a woman named Annie Downs. She was working at this nonprofit called the Mocha Club, doing some really good work, but then one day something shifted for her. She called up her boss and basically said, "Hey, I've got this idea and I'm going to start working on it tomorrow." It wasn't some meticulously crafted revolutionary plan or anything, but it was that change in posture, right?
Yes, that shift from waiting to be told what to do to stepping up and taking the reins.
Exactly. It was that proactive energy that really made the difference. And this idea of the initiator, that's what Godin is talking about. The people who don't wait for permission, who see a need and just start doing something about it.
And it's so interesting because Godin emphasizes that it wasn't necessarily the brilliance of Annie's idea itself, but the simple fact that she decided to begin. That she made the choice to move from being reactive to being proactive. And, this ties into a bigger trend that Godin highlights in the book.
Yeah.
This idea that the traditional gatekeepers are losing their power. Back in the day, if you wanted to get your book published, you had to go through a big publishing house.
Right, right.
If you wanted to get your product into stores, you had to find a big distributor.
Exactly. These big entities controlled access to everything.
They were the gatekeepers, and they still exist, of course, but their influence isn't what it used to be.
This is so true. And Godin points out how back around 2012, there was this huge boom in web startups.
Right.
And what was really striking was how much less initial capital they needed compared to businesses in the past.
Oh, yeah.
It's like the barriers to entry have been lowered in so many industries.
Absolutely. It's not just about having a ton of money or the right connections anymore.
So what is it then? What's that crucial element that makes the difference?
Well, that's where Godin introduces what he calls the seventh imperative.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So he starts by listing these 6 foundational elements, like awareness, like knowing what's going on in the world, in your industry.
Okay, awareness. Got it.
Education, learning the skills you need to succeed.
Right, education. Makes sense.
Connection, building relationships with the right people.
Connections, check.
Consistency, showing up regularly and putting in the work.
Yep, consistency is key.
Building an asset, creating something of value that you can offer to the world.
Okay, building something tangible.
And productivity,
Yeah.
being efficient and getting things done.
Right. So these are all really important foundational elements.
Absolutely. And these are often the things we focus on, right? These are the things we're taught in school, the things we learn on the job.
Yep. Makes sense.
But Godin argues that there's this crucial seventh element that's often overlooked.
And what's that?
It's the guts, the heart, the passion to actually ship something.
To get it out into the world.
Exactly. The first six elements, they're all about building a foundation, but ultimately, you are the seventh ingredient. You're the one who decides to actually make something happen. You're the one who says, go.
Ah, there it is. The difference of go. That's the title of the next section, and it really resonated with me.
It's so simple, but so powerful.
It really seems like that simple act of initiative, that willingness to just say go, is the dividing line between those who succeed and those who don't.
I think so too. Godin suggests an interesting exercise. Think of people and organizations you admire.
Okay, I'm picturing them right now.
And I bet, almost without exception, you'll find that proactive, initiating spirit at the core of their success. They're the ones who are constantly pushing boundaries, trying new things, taking action.
It's like they're not afraid to make mistakes.
Exactly. They see failure as part of the process.
So the real challenge then isn't necessarily about waiting for the perfect moment or having everything perfectly planned out before you take action.
It's about cultivating that habit of starting. It's about getting into that rhythm of beginning, even if things are a little rough around the edges.
You know, it reminds me of this analogy Godin uses. He talks about Craig Venter, the scientist who was instrumental in mapping the human genome.
Oh, yeah, Venter. Fascinating guy.
So Venter can basically design the genetic code of an organism on a computer.
Wow.
But when he synthesizes the actual organic matter in a petri dish, it just sits there lifeless. It needs that initial spark, that motive force, to actually come alive.
Wow. That's such a powerful image.
It is, right.
Yeah.
And Godin connects this to all the opportunities around us.
Yeah.
The organizations, the platforms, the ideas
Yeah.
that are just waiting for someone to provide that missing element of initiative.
To bring them to life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, right, what are the things in our lives, in our work, that are just sitting there waiting for us to breathe life into them?
I love how Godin frames it, too. He doesn't just say, take action or be proactive. He uses this really playful analogy, the buzzer box.
Oh, yeah, the buzzer box. Tell me about that.
So he talks about this big metal box that his uncle made for his cousin. It had all these switches and lights and buttons. To an adult, it might seem kind of pointless. But a kid's natural inclination is to start interacting with it.
Right, to just start pushing buttons and flipping switches to see what happens.
Exactly. They want to figure out the cause and effect. If I do this, then that happens.
It's pure experimentation.
Pure curiosity. And Gaydon says, life is a buzzer box. Poke it.
I love that. Poke it. Don't be afraid to experiment.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to try things, to see what happens. And, so much of understanding how things really work comes from that very active poking.
So true. Whether we're talking about understanding our customers, the dynamics of our market, even the unspoken rules of our workplace.
It's all about taking those small actions, observing the responses, and adjusting accordingly.
And through that process, we gain a sense of ownership.
Not necessarily ownership in the traditional sense, but the power to actually influence outcomes.
So, for everyone listening, I think it's worth asking ourselves, what are the buzzer boxes in our lives? What are those things we've been hesitant to poke?
Yeah, what are those areas where we could experiment a little, try something new, and see what happens?
Now, Godin then goes on to lay out what he calls the elements of production.
Oh, yeah, this is interesting.
So he lists all the traditional components you need to create something. Idea, people, place, raw materials, distribution, money, marketing.
All the essential ingredients.
Right. But his central argument is that all of these elements have become significantly easier and more affordable to access than ever before.
Oh, for sure.
So if these aren't the main obstacles anymore, what is? What's the real bottleneck?
Well, according to Godin, it's the motive force.
The willingness to just say, go.
Exactly. He argues that without that initial spark of initiative, all those other readily available resources are basically useless. The market might be ripe, the money might be there, but nothing happens until someone steps up and decides to initiate.
It's like having all the ingredients for a delicious meal, but not having the energy to actually cook it.
Perfect analogy.
Now, this leads into a really interesting and kind of unsettling concept that Godin discusses. He talks about walking in circles.
Walking in circles.
Yeah, he references Dr. Jan Sumann's research on what happens when people get lost without a map or any landmark.
Oh, right. I've heard about this.
So they might try their best to walk in a straight line, but they almost always end up going in circles.
It's like our internal compass gets thrown off.
Exactly. And Godin's point is that in any endeavor, whether we're talking about navigating a literal wilderness or building a new project, someone needs to take that first step to draw a map, to provide that initial direction for others to follow.
It's about creating a sense of purpose and orientation.
And this is where he asks a really thought-provoking question. Who says yes? He points out that most organizations have VPs or directors responsible for all sorts of crucial functions.
Right. Strategy, finance, marketing, all that.
But the person explicitly in charge of starting things, of giving that crucial initial yes, is often absent from the organizational chart.
It's like there's this missing role.
A void that needs to be filled.
And it makes you think, right, what if that person could be you?
Yeah, what if you could step into that role and be the one to say yes to new ideas, to new possibilities?
Definitely something to consider.
So this brings us to the big question. What can you start? And this is where Godin really challenges a common assumption. He emphasizes that taking initiative doesn't have to be this monumental, world-changing, incredibly risky undertaking.
Right. It can be much smaller than that.
It can be those small, everyday actions within your current sphere of influence.
Like offering to help a colleague who's struggling.
Or identifying a more efficient way to handle a routine task.
Or even just fixing something that's been annoying everyone.
It's about recognizing a need and taking action. And Godin's message is so simple, but so profound. Soon is not as good as now.
It's about recognizing the power of immediate action.
Exactly. Even if it's a small action, even if it feels insignificant.
You know, it reminds me of something Godin talks about later in the book. He discusses different kinds of capital.
Oh yeah, tell me about that.
So he lists the traditional ones. Financial capital, your money, network capital, your connections, intellectual capital, your knowledge, physical capital, your resources, and prestige capital, your reputation.
These are all important forms of capital, for sure.
Absolutely. But Godin argues that in today's world, there's another form of capital that's even more important.
And what's that?
He calls it instigation capital.
Instigation capital.
That's right. It's the desire and the ability to say yes and move forward.
It's like that internal drive to make things happen.
Exactly. It's about having that bias toward action. And, you know, in many cases today, instigation capital trumps all those other forms of capital.
It's like, think about someone who has a brilliant idea but no funding versus someone who has a less revolutionary idea but the relentless drive to actually build and market it.
Right, right.
In many cases, the person with the instigation capital is more likely to succeed.
They're the ones who are going to get things done.
And this brings us to another interesting concept that Godin introduces. He calls it double-double.
Double-double, like the coffee order?
I know, right? It sounds kind of funny, but it's a really powerful idea. So he's basically saying that in a smaller, less competitive environment, a single significant innovation could give you a lasting advantage.
Right. You could kind of coast on that one big win.
Exactly. But in today's hyper-connected Google world, with virtually unlimited competition and instant access to information, simply doubling your innovation isn't enough to stay ahead.
Wow, yeah. It's like the pace of change is accelerating exponentially.
It is. And Godin argues that the only viable way to thrive in this environment is to double and then double again.
Wow.
To constantly be iterating on your innovation, starting new initiatives even before the previous ones have fully matured.
It's like you can't ever stop moving.
You can't. And it's not just about being fast in your execution. It's about embracing shorter cycles of development and a relentless focus on questioning the status quo.
It's about constantly challenging assumptions and looking for new ways to do things.
Exactly. But not aimlessly, he says. It's about being aimful.
Aimful, yeah. Having a clear sense of purpose and direction even amidst all the chaos.
You know, Godin then makes this really important distinction between flux and risk.
Okay, I'm listening.
So flux is simply movement. It's the constant changes happening all around us.
The ebb and flow of things.
Exactly. Risk, on the other hand, involves the potential for both winning and losing.
Right. It's about taking a gamble.
And Godin argues that we often conflate these two ideas.
We get them mixed up.
And our fear of risk can lead us to resist any form of movement or change.
We cling to what's familiar.
But here's the thing. In a world that's constantly in flux, not initiating, staying static, is actually the most dangerous position to be in.
Wow, I never thought about it that way.
It is, right. He says it's like being a rock in a flowing river.
Oh, yeah, I remember that analogy.
The rock might appear stable,
Right, it looks like it's not going anywhere.
but it's constantly being eroded and is vulnerable to being swept away by the current.
It's a false sense of security.
Exactly. So embracing flux, embracing change is actually the safest course of action.
It's about adapting to the environment.
And it's about taking initiative to shape the environment to our advantage.
So how do we overcome that fear of risk, that fear of failure that holds so many of us back?
Well, Godin tackles this head-on in a section he calls The Trail of Failure. He starts by pointing out how much our society loves to scrutinize and analyze failures.
Oh, yeah, we love to dissect what went wrong.
We do.
Mhm.
But then he lists all these incredibly successful individuals, Oprah Winfrey, Mark Cuban, so many others, who have encountered countless failures throughout their journeys.
They've all stumbled and fallen along the way.
They have. And his point is, the more you actively engage and initiate, the more likely you are to experience failure along the way.
It's like failure is an inevitable part of the process.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's not something to be afraid of. It's something to learn from.
And it's important to clarify what kind of failure Godin's talking about.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
He's not talking about failure that comes from laziness or a lack of respect for the work.
Right.
He's talking about the failure that arises when people with good intentions are trying to create something new and meaningful.
It's like they're putting themselves out there, taking risks, and sometimes things don't work out.
Exactly. But even in those failures, there are valuable lessons to be learned.
And Godin argues that embracing this path of initiative, even with the inevitable stumbles, ultimately leads to far greater success than playing it safe and avoiding any potential missteps. It's about having the courage to try, to experiment, to fail forward.
Now, this leads into another important concept that Godin explores. He calls it the epidemic.
The epidemic.
Yeah, it's that feeling of being paralyzed by uncertainty.
Okay, I know that feeling.
That inability to take that first step because we're so afraid of making the wrong move.
It's like we're frozen in place.
And Godin brings up the concept of the lizard brain.
The lizard brain. What's that?
It's that primal, fear-driven part of our brain that's always looking for threats.
Oh, right, our fight or flight response.
Exactly. And it can really hold us back when we're trying to do something new or different.
It's like our lizard brain is screaming at us to stay safe, to not take any risks.
And then there's what Stephen Pressfield calls the resistance.
The resistance.
It's that internal voice that actively tries to discourage us from starting anything that truly matters. Oh, I know that voice all too well.
It's the voice that tells us we're not good enough, that we're going to fail, that we should just give up before we even start.
It's so insidious.
It is. But the first step to overcoming it is simply recognizing it for what it is.
Becoming aware of that internal resistance.
Exactly. And then we can start to challenge it.
And Godin emphasizes the importance of discipline and consistency. He talks about the first rule of doing work that matters. Go to work on a regular basis.
Show up, even when you don't feel like it.
Establish a schedule and stick to it. Don't let setbacks or feelings of anxiety derail your commitment.
And this reminds me of what Godin says about Google.
Oh yeah, Google. What about them?
He talks about how Google, even after achieving phenomenal success with their initial groundbreaking innovations, have continued to invest heavily in a multitude of new projects.
They're not afraid to experiment.
They're not, even though they know that many of those projects will ultimately fail.
They're willing to take risks.
They are. And their fundamental approach seems to be, at least we're not napping.
It's like they're constantly pushing themselves to explore new frontiers.
They are.
Yeah.
And it's that continuous drive to initiate and experiment that really sets them apart.
Now, speaking of experimentation, Godin offers a really interesting perspective on ego.
Oh, yeah. I'm curious to hear this.
So he titles this section, Your Ego and Your Project. And while ego often has negative connotations, Godin argues that it can actually be a powerful motivator.
In a good way.
In a good way. He says that our ego can drive us to produce better work and seek recognition for it.
It's like that internal desire to prove ourselves.
Exactly. And Godin suggests that we should let our ego fuel our initial push to start.
To get the ball rolling.
But then, once the project is in motion, we should be willing to let others take the credit, if that's what it takes to actually get it shipped and into the world.
It's about putting the success of the project above our own personal ego.
It's about letting go of the need for individual recognition and focusing on the bigger picture.
Now, Godin then shifts gears slightly and talks about redefining quality.
Okay, I'm interested to hear this.
So he explains how the traditional definition of quality has evolved from simply being good enough to ensuring that something is without defects.
It's like we've raised the bar.
We have.
Yeah.
But the problem is, most of the competition today already meets that basic standard of quality.
So it's not enough to just be defect-free anymore.
It's not. To truly stand out, you need to be remarkable, you need to be deeply connected with your audience, and you need to be offering something genuinely new.
It's about going above and beyond the expected.
And all of these things require proactive initiative.
They require us to step outside our comfort zones and try new things.
Godin then delves into a really interesting phenomenon that he calls being brainwashed by the pit boss.
The pit boss, like in a casino.
Yeah, it's a metaphor for traditional systems of control.
Okay, I see.
So he's talking about how traditional factory systems often prioritize strict compliance and adherence to rules over individual initiative and creative thinking.
It's like that old school assembly line mentality.
Exactly. And Godin argues that this kind of thinking can be incredibly stifling.
It can kill innovation.
It can. He uses examples like Detroit auto workers and symphony musicians, where this kind of rigid top-down control ultimately led to stagnation.
It's like they were so focused on following the rules that they forgot how to think for themselves.
And the fundamental problem is that you can't achieve growth by becoming increasingly predictable and ordinary in a market that's constantly seeking something better and more innovative.
You have to stand out.
You do. And that requires initiative.
So how do we break free from this kind of brainwashing?
Well, Godin challenges us to ask ourselves a very simple but very powerful question. Why is this mediocre?
Why is this mediocre? I like that.
He points out that we're often quick to complain about systems that are actively broken.
Right, the things that are clearly not working.
But we often passively accept products and services that are merely mediocre.
We just kind of shrug and say, oh, well, that's just how it is.
But it doesn't have to be that way.
We can demand better.
We can. And Godin urges us to find that internal energy to challenge mediocrity in our own spheres and strive for something significantly better.
And when you're trying to identify what's holding you back from taking that leap, he says, look for the fear.
Ah, such a simple but powerful reminder. Fear is often the root of inaction.
Now, speaking of fear, Godin then asks a really interesting question. Where did curious go?
Where did curious go? I love that.
Yeah, it's a great question. He contrasts audiences watching magicians who are intensely curious about how the illusions are created with people in their daily jobs who seem to have lost that inherent sense of inquiry.
It's like we've become desensitized to the wonder of the world.
It's like we stopped asking why.
And Godin argues that initiative, much like creativity, is fundamentally fueled by curiosity, that deep desire to understand how things work and how they can be improved.
It's about that childlike sense of wonder.
Exactly. And the initiator isn't just passively wondering, they're actively acting on that curiosity.
They're the ones who are always asking, what if?
They're the ones who are constantly experimenting and exploring.
You know, this reminds me of another important concept that Godin discusses, this idea of pick me, pick me.
Pick me, pick me. Like a kid begging for attention.
Yeah, kinda. He's talking about this tendency to wait for someone else to choose us.
To recognize our potential.
Exactly. To pick us for the team, to give us the promotion, to fund our idea.
It's like we're waiting for someone else to give us permission to shine.
And Godin calls this the tyranny of picked.
The tyranny of picked.
Yeah. He argues that this mentality ultimately leads to a diffusion of responsibility and an externalization of blame.
It's like we're giving away our power.
We are. And instead, Godin encourages us to pick ourselves.
To take ownership of our own destinies.
Exactly. He uses this analogy of the promoter and the organizer.
Okay, tell me about that.
So the organizer waits to be hired by the promoter, but the promoter is the one who holds the power. The promoter is the one who takes the initial risk and makes things happen.
So his point is, why not be the promoter?
Why not be the one who initiates, who takes charge, who makes things happen?
You know, this all ties into a really important point that Godin makes. He clarifies that entrepreneurship is merely a special case.
In the sense that it's not the only way to express initiative.
Exactly. While entrepreneurs obviously initiate to build and grow their businesses, that underlying spirit of initiative is crucial for everyone.
Regardless of their role or title.
Exactly. Smart, successful organizations understand that they need multiple people at all levels who are willing to drive change and improvement.
It's about creating a culture of initiative.
Now, Godin then introduces this concept of the seasons pass to initiative.
The seasons pass, like at a ski resort.
I know, right? Another one of his quirky analogies. But it's actually a really helpful concept. So
Yeah.
he's basically saying that we should make a conscious decision once and for all to be someone who takes action.
To be an initiator.
Exactly. Instead of constantly seeking permission or second-guessing ourselves with every potential step.
It's about giving ourselves permission to act.
He says, ask once, do many.
I love that. Ask once, do many.
It's like buying a season's pass to initiative. Once you've made the decision, you don't have to keep buying individual tickets every time you want to take a ride.
It's about making a commitment to consistent action.
Now, of course, there's a caveat here. Godin acknowledges that there's no free lunch.
Meaning that initiative comes with its own set of challenges.
Exactly. Those who take initiative will inevitably make mistakes, they will face criticism, and sometimes they will be wrong.
It's part of the process.
But Godin argues that this is precisely what makes initiative so valuable and, frankly, so rare.
It's a scarce resource.
Because most people are afraid of making mistakes, afraid of failing.
So the fact that not every attempt will be successful should actually be encouraging.
It should be a sign that we're pushing boundaries, that we're trying new things.
And Godin even suggests implementing team practices to encourage initiative and address fear.
Oh, like what?
He talks about chicken.
Chicken. What's that?
It's a practice where teams not only share their progress, but also openly acknowledge their fears.
Both the fear of failure and, surprisingly, the fear of success.
It's about creating a safe space to be vulnerable.
To admit that we're all human, that we all have doubts and insecurities.
And that it's okay to be afraid.
Now, Godin then dives into the economics of poking, explaining how our lizard brain often misunderstands the real costs and benefits of taking initiative.
Right. Our lizard brain tends to overestimate the negative consequences of being wrong.
It does. But the basic principle Godin lays out is this. If the potential cost of trying something new is significantly less than the cost of doing nothing and maintaining the status quo, then you should absolutely try it.
It's a simple cost-benefit analysis.
But our lizard brain often skews those calculations.
It makes us afraid to take risks.
And that fear can keep us stuck.
Now, Godin also cautions against the trap of Polish this.
Polish this? What does he mean by that?
He's talking about the endless cycle of tweaking and refining that can often become a subtle form of procrastination.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely been guilty of that.
It's like we're so focused on making something perfect that we never actually ship it.
We get stuck in the editing process.
Exactly. And Godin suggests that we should redirect that energy spent on excessive polishing towards actually creating and shipping the work.
Get it out there, get feedback, and then iterate.
And, this reminds me of another important lesson that Godin highlights. He calls it the Semmelweis imperative.
The Semmelweis imperative. I'm not familiar with that one.
It's named after Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian doctor who discovered the importance of hand washing in preventing the spread of disease.
Oh, wow, that's huge.
It was. But Semmelweis struggled to get his colleagues to accept his findings.
Why?
Because he didn't communicate them effectively. He didn't explain the why behind his recommendations, and he came across as abrasive and arrogant.
So his ideas were rejected, even though they were right.
Exactly. And Godin's point is that while taking initiative and poking the box is crucial, it's equally important to do so with tact, empathy, and effective communication.
You have to be able to bring people along with